Alright, let's try this again. I'm sure a lot of you know about Mario at this point. Most popular video game character, main mascot of Nintendo, and most importantly, has appeared in tons of games. With such a grandiose catalog of games, that leads to the question of how long it'd take to beat every single one. Well, given that you clicked on a video literally proclaiming to be playing every Mario game, that's what I want to find out myself. If you have been following me for the past 7 or so months, you'll know that I've started a series called Super Mario Mayhem, where I play through every Mario game. Originally I was only going to do the playthrough videos, but considering that people probably don't want to watch a guy mumble his way through a game, I decided to make summary videos talking about my thoughts and experience with the games. These summary videos will be split based on release year, so in this video I'll be talking about the games released between 1981 and 1982. If you're curious what games I'm playing, I'm sourcing it from the Super Mario Wiki's list of games, and I also have a spreadsheet linked in the description to see what exactly I'll be playing. With that being said, let's get started with... Well, we have to start somewhere. Now the challenge with talking about Donkey Kong is trying not to regurgitate what other people have already said about it. But if I had to describe the gameplay of Donkey Kong, you play as Mario. He has always been called Mario in the Western localization, and was only called Jumpman on the cabinet because they didn't have enough time to change it. Sorry Jumpman believers, Jumpman was only a temporary name. Anyways, as Mario, he must scale a construction site in order to rescue Pauline, who at this time was just called Lady, from the clutches of Donkey Kong. No relations to King Kong. Climb up the structure for 3 levels, remove the rivets in the last stage, and congratulations, you win the game. Now do it again. Now, I'm sure a lot of you watching this are familiar with the NES port of this game, and if you thought that this game has gotten too easy for you, then I highly recommend trying out the arcade original. I was also in the camp of playing the NES version beforehand, so beating this game for the first time in a while definitely was thrilling. Although I did play on the Japanese version, which means that I got to play through every level in one loop as opposed to the international release, which adds a new stage every other loop. Overall, Donkey Kong is still a fun game to play, at least the arcade original is. I say that because given the popularity Donkey Kong got back then, tons of ports were created for various home consoles and computers. And I have to play through them all. I hope you're prepared for a lot of Donkey Kong, because I wasn't. Before we get into the ports proper, let's take a detour and talk about Crazy Kong. Now when I was compiling the list of how much shit I had to play, I never heard of Crazy Kong. Apparently, this was an official clone of the original Donkey Kong distributed by some company called Falcon, which seems to only be notable for making this game. You might be thinking that the concept of Nintendo allowing another company distributing their games is a crime worse than arson, but keep in mind that Nintendo was not as strict as they are now with their intellectual properties. In fact, it wasn't uncommon to see arcade manufacturers distribute other companies' games. Nintendo did it themselves back in the 70s with Head-On and Bombi, both being Sega and Namco games respectively. But enough with the context. What does the game look like? Big fan of green, I see. Now, I know what you're thinking. Riley, what the fuck is this? Well, let me tell you. This is the original Donkey Kong running off of Crazy Climber hardware, with some minor changes to the sprites. More specifically, this horrifying skinwalker trying to be Donkey Kong. Oh yeah, and the color palettes and sounds are fucked as well. I assume that is a consequence of trying to run a game on hardware it wasn't designed for, but that's just a guess. Anyways, the game looks a lot more ugly as a result, and the sound effects are ear-grating. Mario screams every time he jumps. In terms of gameplay changes, there are none. It's literally the same game again, with the same layout and stage order. It's kind of baffling that at some point in history, some random Japanese arcade had Crazy Kong instead of the original Donkey Kong. And for some unfortunate souls, this was their first exposure to Donkey Kong. In conclusion, if you want to play Donkey Kong and torture your senses at the same time, give Crazy Kong a try, you masochist. Wow, that was terrible. I hope the next game isn't a sequel to this. Oh, for fuck! Your eyes are not deceiving you. There is, indeed, a sequel to Crazy Kong. And if you can believe it, the same issues from the first game are here too. Now, despite this game looking, and by extension, playing the same, There are notable differences worth talking about. First off, there is an intro cutscene where the titular Crazy Con escapes. Very thrilling. There's also an addition to the end of the game where Crazy Con says give up, being the first primate to curse the player before Sky Skipper. If that wasn't enough for you, on the second loop, there's slight modifications to the stages to make them harder. Wow. Don't these changes make you want to stop everything you're doing to play this masterpiece? In all honesty, this game is a smidge better than the original Crazy Kong. But at the end of the day, it's still a piece of shit. And Nintendo wants you to forget that these games ever happened. In fact, Nintendo even sued Falcon over these games because apparently, Falcon began exporting these Crazy Con machines outside of Japan, which was in violation with their agreement with Nintendo. Also, they started making unlicensed Donkey Kong Jr. machines called Crazy Jr., which thankfully I don't have to play. In short, Nintendo sued Falcon, the president of Falcon got arrested for unauthorized copying, and now you know why you've never heard their name before. Also, I did this. But, this is, these two games were, oh. Now that's crazy. The next game is Donkey Kong, the Game & Watch unit. For those who don't know, Game & Watch were these little handheld LCD games that Nintendo made throughout the 80s, after the creator, Gunpei Yokoi, witnessed a bored businessman fiddle with a calculator to pass the time. They basically functioned as bite-sized score chasers you used to pass the time, and it proved to be very popular during the 80s. Nowadays, you mainly remember the Game & Watch as that one character from Super Smash Bros. With Mr. Game & Watch. And since Donkey Kong was blowing up around the time Nintendo were making Game & Watches, obviously Donkey Kong got an adaptation in handheld form. In fact, this adaptation turned out to be a milestone release, as not only was it the first in the multi-screen series, but it was the first time ever that people got to use the D-pad for movement. Now you might be wondering why I'm calling this version of Donkey Kong an adaptation rather than a port. Well, I believe that this version is not a port of the original game. To me, a port is trying to emulate the original arcade game to the best of the system's ability. Donkey Kong on Game & Watch doesn't really fit that molding. Not only is it a single screen, but personally it doesn't even try to be like the arcade original. Sure, it shares some elements from the original, but the way the game plays is completely different. Instead of simply reaching the top, Mario must flip a switch that activates a crane and jump onto it to remove a peg from Donkey Kong's platform. Do that 4 times and Donkey Kong smashes his jaw onto some gritters. Afterwards, the game loops and you keep playing until you lose all your lives. For some reason, as simple and basic as this game is, I enjoy it quite a lot. There's this simplistic charm that I get from these Game & Watch titles that keep me invested. And personally, I think that Donkey Kong on Game & Watch is one of my favorite Game & Watch titles. Considering that there's more Game & Watch later on, that doesn't mean that the later titles are bad in any way, but we'll talk about those when we get there. And here is the first of many ports of Donkey Kong, and we had to start with the most basic form of it. If you know how most arcade ports on the Atari 2600 are handled, you'll know that they have to compromise a lot to get them working on the console. Donkey Kong on the 2600 is no different. Simple graphics, simple sounds, rudimentary physics, it's bare bones. The port only has 2 stages, the first and the last level. You could literally beat this in about 5 minutes. Even though my expectations for this port was at the lowest it could be, I still felt a little underwhelmed with this port. At least with other arcade ports on the Atari 2600, it was fine having only 1 screen. But because Donkey Kong was a more complicated game to port, expectations were higher than usual. In fact, even the original developer of the port said it could have been better if circumstances were more ideal. So, apparently, the guy was only given a handful of months to finish the port and was working with only 4 kilobytes, which wasn't even the largest cartridge available, mind you. This caused some things to get cut and compromised in order to fit the limited space and meet the deadline, and as such, in retrospect, this port was not seen as the greatest. In fact, because this port is not remembered fondly, a conspiracy was created saying that Coleco purposefully made the Atari port crap in order to make the ColecoVision version look better. So yeah, while the port itself isn't too special on its own, learning about the story behind it was definitely interesting. And now for something completely terrible. Back in the 80s, Coleco had this series of handheld games that were ports of popular arcade games. They did Pac-Man, Frogger, Galaxian, and of course, Donkey Kong. And let me be the one to tell you that the Donkey Kong Coleco Mini Arcade is the worst adaptation of the original. You see, unlike the Game & Watch version, the Coleco Mini Arcade version is trying to recapture the arcade experience as best as they can. However, this creates the issue of getting too ambitious, with the idea of a portable Donkey Kong, since the only tech they had is LCD screens. I'm not going to sugarcoat it, this port is dog shit, and let me tell you why. First off, the controls are pure ass. For some reason, Mario does not move if you tap a specific direction. You need to hold down a direction for Mario to move, which leads to the second issue I have with the controls. Because you have to hold down a direction, there are moments where you hold it down for too long and you do a double input. Now, that wouldn't be an issue if you couldn't die from trying to move off the screen. I guess they wanted to emulate Mario falling off from a great height like in the original, but because the stage itself is completely flat and covers the whole width of the screen, it just feels like you died for no reason. Another issue with the controls comes from jumping. So jumping over barrels, there's nothing out of the ordinary with that, even though it feels off to do so. But do you remember when I said that they tried to recapture the arcade experience? Yeah, they also included the last stage where you need to remove the rivets. And if you remember, you have to jump over the gaps they create when removed, which requires a direction and a jump. Combine this and the jank controls, and you have pain. I cannot emphasize how sluggish the controls are. They actively hamper what little enjoyment I could get, and make the game infinitely more frustrating to play. It's so bad that this was one of the games I couldn't beat because of how bad the game was. You could chalk up my issues with, oh, you're playing on emulator, so it probably sucked. But even if I were playing the real deal, I still say that this version sucks ass. Don't play this one. Now we start getting into the games, or rather ports, that I don't have a lot to say about. If you want my opinion on how faithful the ColecoVision version is to the original, it's not completely faithful, but it does a fair enough job. Really, this port is more similar to the Famicom version, where it cuts the cement factory level, but it also cuts some other aspects. For example, you'll notice that the stages are much more compact to accommodate the smaller, more horizontal screen space. This will be something you'll notice with other home console and computer ports. Another noticeable thing about this port specifically is that some objects are cut. You'll notice this when playing 75 meter, the level with the springs, and you'll see that, well, there are no springs. Instead, in place of them is a single fireball enemy, which on paper doesn't sound bad, but in execution, it causes the fireball at the top to gatekeep the end of the level. Other than that, this is a perfectly fine port. Not too great, but not bad at all. So, you've made a very successful arcade game. What do you do now? Make a direct sequel that is the exact same as the last game in terms of gameplay? Or do you divert from the original gameplay, partially using the code from the developer that you hired to program your smash hit without permission, which may or may not lead to a lawsuit in the future? Could you guess what Nintendo went for? Donkey Kong Jr. is the direct follow-up to the original game, and they definitely changed a lot. The story this time is that after the events of Donkey Kong, Mario decided to turn evil and capture the titular ape. Unbeknownst to Mario, it turns out that DK is a single father, and now Donkey Kong Jr. has to rescue his old man. Truly, a story for the ages. So, with it being the successor to Donkey Kong, how does Jr. play? Much like Donkey Kong Sr., I've played the NES version of DK Jr. before, so playing the arcade game was a much more challenging task than I'm used to. The basic gist is that the gameplay is very much like its predecessor. You climb up a screen for 3 levels, break off something in the final stage, rinse and repeat until you lose all your lives. What differentiates this game is that instead of climbing ladders, you're climbing vines, which is the primary thing you'll be doing in this game. You'll get the feel of this mechanic throughout the 4 levels you play. The first level contains about 75% vine for Junior to climb all over. The second stage is more or less the same, but has this spring that you can use to skip some of the level 20% of the time, and a single fruit that serves 0 purpose. The third level has all these sparks going everywhere and can catch you off guard sometimes if you're not paying attention. And finally, the last stage is where you free your father by shuffling these keys into the slots at the top while getting bombarded by hordes of birds. Now I understand that this game may not be the grand successor to one of the hottest arcade coin-ops of 1981, but I can't deny that they did try to distinguish Junior from its predecessor. I feel like when companies make sequels to games, most of the time, they just give people more of the same with some new additions. Meanwhile, with DK Jr., Nintendo did want to make something unique, to give players a new experience as opposed to cranking out the same shit but with different levels. Anyways, while DK Jr. is not the greatest of all time, I still had fun with it. In fact, the increased difficulty in the arcade version made for a more exhilarating time. And much like his father, Jr. also got a bunch of ports that I'll be playing. Except for that one. I'm not touching that thing. We've done the Atari 2600. We've done the ColecoVision. Now all that's left for the major 3 of the second generation of consoles is Mattel's Intellivision. Now, I know next to nothing about the Intellivision, other than it's similar to the ColecoVision, both name-wise and controller-wise. Seriously, why did these companies think putting a number pad on their controllers was a good idea? Did they think that more buttons mean a better controller? All it does is make the controls more complicated than needed. But I'm getting off topic. Let's get back to what we're here for, the Donkey Kong port. Let's see that gameplay. Holy shit. I absolutely forgot how empty this version was, and I'm not talking about the minimalistic graphics either. There are only 2 stages in this version. Let that sink in. 2 stages. You know what else had 2 stages? The Atari 2600 version. At least in the Atari version, you could excuse it for having less content. I have no idea if this is just the standard for the Intellivision, but if it is, that's really embarrassing. Perhaps I've been spoiled by the ColecoVision port. Hey look, Donkey Kong Jr. got a Game & Watch game just like his pops. Actually, he got 2. Technically 3, but we're not talking about that one right now. Yes, it was only a matter of time before Nintendo started to capitalize on Donkey Kong Jr., and they started with a Game & Watch title. This time, they were rocking that classic widescreen model that was common for a bunch of Game & Watch titles. And much like Donkey Kong Sr., this is less of a port and more of an adaptation of themes and elements from the arcade original. You're still rescuing Donkey Kong from Mario, and you're still dodging obstacles while climbing on vines. Well, more like hanging on to them. Grab the key 4 times to beat the game, and repeat until you perish. And again, much like Donkey Kong on Game & Watch, this one has that simplistic charm that keeps me engaged for a while. Now, you may have noticed that I said that Donkey Kong Jr. got 2 games under the Game & Watch label, and that's because there's another. But I'll have to talk about that in the next video. I would also like to call out the Super Mario Wiki for having the 2 versions named Donkey Kong Jr. on one page. Like, come on! You've got to have known that these 2 were different games. Why did it take you until recently to split it? What the fuck? We end off this video's selection of games with one more Game & Watch title. This time, back on the multi-screen unit. At first glance, you may think that Greenhouse has nothing to do with Mario whatsoever. But digging a little deeper, you'll find out that the person you play as is none other than Stanley the Bugman. You know, the guy from the other Donkey Kong arcade game. This was his first appearance ever, and as the Bugman you are, your goal is to stop these pesky bugs from eating your plates. Unlike the Game & Watch games we looked at before, there isn't a definitive goal to be going for. Just blast the bugs with your bug spray and rack up a high score. The challenge with trying to get a high score is multitasking between both screens. And after a while, the amount of bugs coming at you get more intense, and eventually, you'll choke. I'm not sure if I'm just a pro at this game, but I was able to last for a long time, with the final score of 614. I believe at some point I just turned off my brain and just went with the motions. To be real with you, I'm a little split between this one. While it has that Game & Watch charm that I like, the gameplay loop can get pretty bland fast. Also, once you begin to struggle and lose your first life, it can be tough to get back into the flow. If this game looks interesting to you, give it a shot. Well, that's all the games I've played from 1981 to 1982. Going into the challenge, I knew that Donkey Kong would be a large aspect of the series early on, but nothing really prepared me for how much Donkey Kong there really was. And we're only getting started. But hey, you have to start somewhere. Before closing off, I'd like to give a huge shout out to Wyoming on YouTube. They're another lunatic playing every Mario game, and I do mean every single one. They just started out their journey, and from what I've seen, they are dedicated and thorough about their journey. So much that they even helped me with finding the games I thought I couldn't play. Genuinely, they are doing so much in preserving and documenting Mario history. So give them a watch whenever they livestream or upload a video, and subscribe to them if you're interested. And of course, thank you for watching all the way through this video. This was the first time I've done something like this, so if you enjoyed this video, give it a like and subscribe if you aren't already. You know, the usual YouTube things to do. In the next video, we enter the glorious year of 1983. The obligation of playing the Donkey Kong ports continues with the addition of his son. The family computer gets released in Japan, and we get introduced to the Green Brother himself. There's a lot to unpack, and the journey has only begun, so I hope to see you next time in my quest to beat every Mario game.